Good morning, everyone. Today I want to do another book review, and this is of Michael Moorcock's the second book in his The Sanctuary of the White Friars series, The Woods of Arcady. And that's from a poem by William Butler Yeats called The Happy Shepherd. The appropriate lines which he uses in his opening are, "The woods of Arcady are dead, and over is their antique joy. Of old the world on dreaming fed, gray truth is now her painted toy." The poem goes on for much, much, much longer, and it's kind of an interesting reflection on which is better, dreaming or reality. And it's sort of concludes that dreaming may be a little bit better, even if it's not the truth. That has a definite impact on the story here, and this book is like I said, The Woods of Arcady, and this is the hardcover, which I got for a remarkably low price. It lists on the cover that if I had bought it here in Canada, the Canadian price is $43.99. Well, I paid $11 for this, plus shipping and handling, so it was $25. But sometimes waiting for a year, you can get a good discount. I really enjoyed it. Paul DeFilippo, who's also a science fiction writer, in his review said that all Moorcock fans will find something to hate in this novel. That's a funny thing to say. I also think that all Moorcock fans will find something to love in it, particularly if you are a fan of the quote-unquote second ether novels, those being Blood, A Southern Fantasy, Fabulous Harbors, and The War Amongst the Angels, which are also collected in one of the Gollancz novels, which I happen to have an inscribed and personalized copy of, called The War Amongst the Angels. Very interesting, completely non-linear books, which don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense, but they're tremendous fun. They filled with both fictional and historical characters. Dick Turpin shows up, and some British highwaymen from the 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and the Three Musketeers, and all sorts of strange characters. And some of those characters pop back up in this book. It begins as I said, it's a continuation of The Whispering Swarm, which was the previous novel, which was sort of a semi-fictional and semi-true autobiography of Moorcock, interspersed with a rather wild adventure. And in that one, the adventure was a little more subtle. This one, it starts out with a little bit boring. It's the story of a guy named John Blackstone, and it's kind of going on about him and his relatives and his relations and how they get along and they don't get along. Then that's interspersed with a little bit of biography, real biography of Moorcock, about how he grew up. And one of the first things he remembers is his mother holding him up to watch the contrails of fighters over England during the Battle of Britain, and also his early writing career as he started working for a magazine called Tarzan Adventures, and writing some short stories for Ted Carnell, who's a famous editor of Science Fantasy magazine, where he submitted some of his early Elric stories, and also earlier works, things like The Rituals of Infinity and The Fire Clown. And The Winds of Limbo, all of which are good in their own right. And it really takes off about the 100th page. And I've written down some notes of some of the things that I enjoyed, and hopefully you'll enjoy too. I'm not going to spoil the entire book for you and tell you entirely what it's about. But it starts off, like I said, it's the thing about the Blackstones, and also about Moorcock's his first marriage, and his two daughters. And as we start out, he's about 22, 23, maybe 25, and his marriage is starting to fall apart. And he's trying to kind of hold it together and be a better father. He takes his family to Paris, and he wants to go see the musical performance, and his wife is not interested, and so he goes by himself. And he's mysteriously kidnapped by, of all people, the Four Musketeers, and also Claude Duval, the highwayman, who is really more who the Dick Turpin legend was based on. Duval was known to be courteous and not to harm women, and he never killed anybody. Turpin was actually a murderer and a horse thief, and was hanged for horse theft, not for highway robbery. But he was not a nice person. He beat some pistol whipped people and was really an awful person. Duval was known to be a gentleman, albeit he robbed people at gunpoint. He paid a man to dance with his wife, that kind of thing. So he's more of a romantic character, though he isn't in the whole novel. And again, I'm not going to spoil everything for you, but just some things I enjoyed. There's a note on page 87, and I'm going to read it for you, where you're talking about some of these characters from the second ether. One of them being Captain Buggerly Utterly says. Sit tight, Scythy. Buggerly leaned forward and, with a tendril of mustachioed tenderness, touches the drive-on button and, shrugging his shoulders, sets the controls for the heart of the sun. That's a reference to my favorite Pink Floyd song, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is an early Syd Barrett song, which I really enjoy. I thought that was great that Moorcock mentioned that. On page 93, he says, again, this is Buggerly Otherly, the captain of Now the Clouds Have Meaning, an advanced spaceship, says, this is the Rose speaking, says, ease off there, Pards. Her melodious voice came through the omniphone. Give it a bit of evil company and then bring her round on a kill Mr. Swerve, Captain Otherly. I'm thinking Charles Lever. I'll meet you at Gelatinous Junction and make sure you get ready for a new jar of preservatives. Kill Mr. Swerve is obviously a reference to Lemmy. Lemmy's name was Ian Fraser Kilmister. So that's a tribute to his late friend, who he knew way back from the Hawkwind days. And of course, Moorcock was associated with Hawkwind. He used to read poetry at their concerts. So he knew Lemmy from way back, back from the days of when he sang Silver Machine. 96. Let's see. I'm not sure where this is. He's talking about the Rose here, and he says, I certainly belong to her manifestations across the damned burdensome multiverse. I like that phrase, burdensome multiverse. Page 121, he mentions the Whispering Swarm, and he doesn't mention it in the way that we think. He talks about it as being something that kind of annoys him, about the real world kind of impinging on his dreams. Sort of. That's what the Whispering Swarm means to him. Page 126, he says the balance directs our destiny, the great cosmic balance that he refers to in his Eternal Champion series. Page 137, he mentions Las Cascadas, which is from the War Amongst the Angels, and that it is prominent in the Second Ether series. The Rose appears again on page 139. In point 170, he mentions something called that's an orrery, and it's also called a fulcrum, which is apparently like a model of the multiverse. It's not just a model of the solar system, a model of the entire multiverse, which I found interesting. Again, not going to go into too much detail there. Page 175, he says, my multiverse was a jeweled tapestry. And he mentions 1963 and Ted Cornell mentioning, I think the multiverse is first mentioned in The Rituals of Infinity, which is one of his early science fiction books, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Page 180 to 181, as we know, legends say Las Cascadas is the only remaining fragment of lost Atlantis. So that tells you a little mythology there. Page 181, this is interesting. Aha, she exclaimed, enlightened. You are upon a substantial dream quest, as am I. And that's the Rose speaking. And then page 182, he makes reference to, I want to find this exactly what he says here, because it's interesting to me. This reference is one of my other favorite books. He says, I had not the slightest notion what she meant by dream quest, though the word was faintly familiar, perhaps from the title of the Lovecraft story I had seen. What was its association with the Second Ether? That story being my favorite Lovecraft novel, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which apparently Moorcock liked quite a bit too. I like that because that's one of my favorite things. Page 188 says, have you not heard of these infidels, Simon Danziger, Jeremy Cornelius, and the kind of, obviously a reference to Jerry Cornelius. Page 188, the Spamergain, we don't know it's the Spamergain yet, but somebody says, ah, darling fishlings. Well, that's a clue to what's going on later on. Page 191, we must steer an intense and accurate course, or this whole delicate enterprise is finished and Spammer's mighty dream is ended. Well, now we know who. There was this strange crate, and the Spammer Gain is actually in the crate. Interestingly, in this novel, again, this is not giving away too much, but the Spammer is described as a cephalopod. I had always thought of her as more like a sort of a space whale, but I realized that was based on the Multiverse comics from the 1990s. That's the way she was depicted. But Moorcock can change characters, obviously, to his whim. They're his characters. And in this, she's described as more of a cephalopod, somewhat like a cuttlefish, but, enormous. Also, she's described as being a multiverse unto herself, both a living goddess and a part of the fabric of the multiverse, which I thought was interesting. Page 192, there's a bit of a poem. "O Captain, grant me mercy. O Captain, grant me pain. O Captain, bring your hammers for the soul of Spammer Gain." That's interesting. I made a note here. I'm going to read you this whole paragraph. "Coherence. My prayer might be answered. Music. Sublime. Vaud Williams. Meredith celebrated the spirit of the lark. Oh, please, some small sense of order. Perhaps fear the original insect. Oh, there is no pity, no mercy, no justice. Nothing can save us. Only that fierce avenging beak. But is the kraken dead, or did the kraken never live? Can she save her children, or are we unsaved? Are we forever deceived by the scent of lavender and roses? Who shall smell the tender flower? Who shall die and who shall live? All the world shall turn to ice, for whom the universe makes sacrifice. How can we tell if she is our mother or our devourer or both?" The Lark Ascending, my favorite 19th century writer with a fine Welsh composer. She stood before me smiling. Was she truly benign? Iron and silver / silver and iron, these are metal, the metal which shall lie on, ellipsis. There are many worse deaths than the axe. Had she given me Meredith, his larks, his woods of Westermain, on whose calm, sweet intelligence I relied, Beauchamp's career, so likely, so near. That's a reference to George Meredith's The Woods of Westermain. George Meredith was an early fantasist and wrote a lot of interesting things, including The Wood Beyond the World, which I just finished reading. A very strange and very good fantasy novel. Lynn Carter considers it the first real adult fantasy novel. That it has adult themes. It's not written for kids. Page 202. When he spoke, the newcomer's voice was warm and liquid, like a leopard's throaty growl, with the sharp-edged purr of a mountain lion. That's referring to a character called Antara. Antara ibn Soya, who is sort of an Arab adventurer, kind of Arabian Nights kind of character who figures in this quest that they're on. Moorcock has been kidnapped, like I said, and he is now adventuring with these people across the Sahara Desert, basically, trying to find something, and that you don't quite know what they're looking for. Page 376, he mentions the word conjunction, which I assume is a reference to the conjunction of the Million Spheres, an event that occurs throughout the Eternal Champion series. Page 377, he mentions the escarpment, maybe the way home. They're heading for something called the Blackstone Escarpment, which is somewhere in Africa, and I won't go into too much of that. It's giving away too much of the plot. 379, he uses the term, "We're tired of making love," and that is from the song "Warriors at the Edge of Time" by Hawkwind, which is a reference to Moorcock's work, and he wrote that song, I believe. Lyrics to the song, I should say. Page 384, this is an interesting segment. He says, "I suspected myself of writing fantasy to escape the whispering swarm of real-world responsibility. Then I criticized contemporary science fiction and fantasy for not achieving the seriousness they claimed. Was I that much of a hypocrite? That much of a coward?" That's kind of an interesting statement there. Page 389 to 90, he mentions Alsacia, which is an area of London, a fictional area of London that he invented for the Whispering Swarm. Page 417, 18. I'm going to read this because I made a note that I wanted to reference it. 417. And we understood how our people carried our Spamalgin, and that's their name for the Spammer game, within. How the Spammer game was our universe, enclosing us, guarding us, relying on us as we relied on her. She was but one universe caring for another, and at the same time, Spammer was contained in every individual. She was one creature protecting her own infinite numbers of other creatures protecting their own, as every creature in the universe supported its spawn and in turn was supported, as we now found ourselves supported, as if within a gigantic seed pod. Kind of an interesting story. I'm not going to go into too much more of that, but that's I thought was interesting. 425, he mentions the off-mu, the last remnant people of Atlantis. They're sort of these rock-like creatures, and I'm not going to go too much more into that because he goes into a lot of detail. Read it for yourself. It's interesting. Page 433, he mentions that the multiverse that he's referencing is the multiverse of William James. And William James was one of the first people to use the term multiverse, but he used it in a religious context, not to mean necessarily an infinity of universes. Page 434, he says, even an earthly cuttlefish's brain could be considerably larger than a human's. That is actually true. He mentions the Empire of Law and the original insect. The original insect is a reference to Queen Siombarg of Chaos. She's referred to as the original insect in some of his Elric stories. Mentioned that, quote-unquote, the house was beaten at the game of time, and that, again, is a reference to the Jugadors and of the first novel, Blood, A Southern Fantasy, and he talks about some of those characters also. The original insect, the chief representative, knew how to pierce through our defensive music, and her straight arrow battlecraft was close to defeating us. Of course, this could not be, for the balance is all that sustains us, a legend. That's interesting. That's an interesting statement. Page 435, he mentions the End of All Songs, which is a reference to his End of Time series. Again, one of my favorite series, even though it's kind of nonsensical and funny, but a parody, but I like that. He mentions the conjunction again on page 446. 447, he says something about BBC posh-stalgia series. I like that term, posh-stalgia. Like, they're deliberately creating these series that create a nostalgia for posh people. Like there was the Poldark and things like that, which are very snooty. Page 456, he says, life here was too visibly attractive. That's about where he is in the story and the adventure. Page 464, he says something, this is interesting. I hold nothing, dear Spammer, save a dreaming mind, a silver wand, a sword engraved with my name. What is that sword? We've yet to find out. Spammer says, spinning, says Spammer, is what we do, and that's about the multiverse spinning around its axis. Page 466, he mentions two iconic airplanes, the Dornier DOX, which was an enormous pre-World War II flying boat that had, I think, 16 engines, or 18. It was enormous passenger carrier. And also the plane, the Hawker Osprey, which was basically a naval version of the Hawker Hart, one of the first dedicated all-metal fighters, and a good fighter, the basis for what later became the Hawker Hurricane. 469, he says, in light of my experiences, I abandoned all notions of linear time. And then he's talking about his vision being expanded. He says, I was seeing in the avian spectrum, and talks about how birds can see deeper into the infrared and ultraviolet than we can, and they can see colors that we can't. Page 475, he mentions a universe of roses and Rose von Beck, and that's a reference, I think, to The Revenge of the Rose, which is my favorite Elric novel, other than the first one. 479, he says, time is only cyclic when we choose it to be. And then page 42, there's a brief epilogue here of The Wounds of Albion, which is going to be the third novel in the series. I'm going to read you the whole thing because I like it, and it's good, and it's a good teaser. I think they might have called my name, or at least a familiar one, because I had the impression I answered them, reassuring them. Everyone has at some time been under the illusion between wakefulness and sleeping of hearing voices, scraps of conversation, phrases spoken in peculiar tones, déjà vu, echoes. Sometimes we attempt to attune our minds to hear more, but usually aren't successful. These are called hypnagogic hallucinations, the beginning of dreams we shall later experience as we sleep. There was a woman, 3 children, a city, a name which occasionally changed, Michael Moorcock. They called in the voices I did not recognize in a language I did not understand. It might have been Sioux. Ericosa, Ericosa, Ericosa. I heard a distant, steady, insistent drumming. Had I hung forever in limbo? I was not being torn away, but I could not see who was calling me. I felt that all humanity had a voice. I begged for it to pause. I saw a wooden fort made variously of palisades and heaped rocks, mounted Norse and Napoleon's hussars, a group of brightly dressed samurai. The fort was manned by soldiers of many kinds, British cavalry from Waterloo, infantry of around the same time, French Mamelukes, English forest rangers, 18th century armed civilians, a massive Carthaginian war elephant, its howdah packed with contemporary British nurses, American natives from the 18th century, American frontier scouts and trappers, while outside the fort massed Sudanese warriors from the time of the Mahdi and the Ottoman Turks. Other armed men were mounted on dinosaurs, lumbering through the relatively low shrubland around the fort. This was like a scenario I laid out from my collection of toy soldiers as a boy, and I was fascinated by the moving details of those living little warriors. I was being drawn to meet them, and I struggled to escape. I felt I was being drawn to yet another battle which would rob me of all I valued. Ericosa, Ericosa von Beck, we need you, champion. I was being drawn into this dreamland, and I was reluctant to go. There were still things I had to do, other narratives to write, commitments to readers and my family. I had promised a third memoir in the sequence. I had to stay to write it. The call was stronger now. I turned to tell Helena what was happening. My wife was gone. I was helpless. The call was stronger. Champion! Ericosa, Ericosa, Ericosa. The voices were insistent and irresistible. I could do nothing else. I gave myself up to them. I let them draw me down for yet another terrible conflict. Perhaps this final time I would redeem myself. That is obviously a reference to the Eternal Champion, and Ericosa, of course, betrayed all of humanity, and the redemption would be for that crime that he committed in that first Eternal Champion novel, where he literally wipes out all of humanity to help the Eldrin. So that's an interesting thing. Moorcock has promised that he is going to resolve, quote unquote, the entire Eternal Champion cycle in the Wounds of Albion. Albion is an old Greek word for England, the United Kingdom, the Great Britain, the entire, it's not just England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, all of Great Britain. So that'll be interesting to see. I think it's a great book. I think it's interesting. It's kind of like a grand boy's adventure. He gets to meet the Four Musketeers and, like I said, Claude Duval and this Prince Antara, who's like an Arabian knight kind of character, and a guy named a kind of professor who's Professor Consensio, who's sort of like Dr. Doolittle. He can communicate with animals. He meets miniature animals, giant animals, miniature dinosaurs, and Blackstone and his wife turn out to be more interesting kind of characters than you think at the beginning. Have a interesting part, and of course there's the second ether characters, particularly the Spammergane, have a very central role, and Pearl Peru, Captain Buggerly Otherly, and Capricorn Schultz, and some of the other characters from those novels reappear. I found it thoroughly entertaining and enjoyable, and I highly recommend it.